Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Kaija. I'm a recent graduate from SUNY Oswego, and this is basically what my honors thesis came to be. So I spent the last 2 years researching microaggressions in the workplace and then creating a presentation about microaggressions, also referred to as subtle acts of exclusion. This is really just a presentation workshop experience to get people more aware about what microaggressions or subtle acts of exclusion are and to teach people how to deal with them in life because they have really negative impacts that we'll go over in a minute. Um, the main objectives of this presentation is to understand what subtle acts of exclusion are and to know how to address them in the workplace. So that's what you should be taking away from this. So to start off, I'm just going to define what SAE or microaggressions are. They're ambiguous and difficult to detect, intentional or unintentional actions that have an exclusionary impact and are often related to marginalized social identities. Um, and so the key thing with this is that there's a couple different people that are involved in SAE. So there's the initiator or the person who commits the act of exclusion. There's the witness, someone who sees it happen. There's targets, the people that the subtle act of exclusion is aimed at or against. And then there's allies, people who witness it and say something or try to help. An important thing to note with those different categories is that you could end up being any one of those people in that situation. So even if you're someone with marginalized social identities, you can still end up being the initiator. It could be even be the same marginalized identity that you have that you're committing an SAE based on. And if you don't know, marginalized social identities are social identities like identifying as a woman, identifying as Jewish, being African American, anything like that, where you are either not the minority, you're the minority, or you've been historically treated as less than, or something like that. So that's kind of what that means and what that implies. So when you're in a situation and you think it might be SAE, how do you know that this is a subtle act of exclusion? You want to think about, did the action make you feel uncomfortable? Did something about the action feel wrong or discriminatory? And does the target of the action look uncomfortable? So if you're a witness and you want to be an ally and you see that the target is really uncomfortable in the situation, that's a pretty good indicator that whatever was said or done was probably wrong. And then I'm actually going to go back so we can look at some examples. Let's see. Oh no. Okay. This is a really awesome resource. Can the people on Zoom see it? Yes. Okay. This is a really awesome resource for if you want to dive more into what microaggressions and subtle acts of exclusion are, and if you want to see more examples. So when you scroll down, it defines them, it goes over some tips, some strategies. But it also has all these different categories. So if you were like, oh, I want to know what some gender microaggressions are, you can click on this and it'll show you some examples. Let's see. So if you see something like this, like she's probably on her period, and you're like, why is that a problem? You could click on it and it will explain what the issue is with saying it. And it will also give you real world examples and talking points, although this one doesn't have any. But sometimes it'll give you things to say if you experience this or if you see it happen. So that's a really awesome resource. Let's see, there's also like another example for religion. If you say, don't you feel like you're being narrow-minded? That's basically telling them that maybe their religion shouldn't be included, shouldn't be accepted, or that there's something wrong with what they believe in. So basically, subtle acts of exclusion are just anything that you say or do. It doesn't have to be a statement, it could be an action that make people feel excluded, make people feel like identities that they don't really have control over make them less than other people. So now, why are they problematic? So there's a lot of things that come out of subtle acts of exclusion. From a psychological standpoint, there's increased depression, increased anxiety, higher stress levels, sleep deprivation, suicidal ideation, and substance abuse problems. So there's a lot of mental health impacts, which is probably not very surprising. But what I found really shocking in my research was that there's also physical impacts. So it's been shown that people who experience microaggressions or subtle acts of exclusion have an increased risk of cardiovascular disease and higher blood pressure. So it's not just like a mental problem, it also actually impacts your physical health. It also impacts in the workplace your performance, your commitment to the organization, things like that, where you don't want to come to work, you don't want to do your job, or you just can't put the attention into your job because you have all these psychological and physical problems that are coming from these instances of microaggressions and subtle acts of exclusion. And then it also has an impact in the academic world. So this was actually not part of my thesis because I was focusing more on the workplace, but I was like, I should probably include some academic impacts for this. So similarly to work impacts, if professors are committing subtle acts of exclusion and the students are either the targets or the witnesses, their performance is going to decrease. Their grades are going to go down. They're not going to feel welcome in the classroom. They're not going to want to share their opinions. They're not going to want to raise their hand in class because they're going to be afraid. And then there's also like between professors, obviously the same thing that happens in the workplace. It's going to cause conflict. It's going to cause problems. And then just in the academic world in general. So even if you're not a professor, if you're just a staff member, it's the same problems that you would see in any other workplace. So less job commitment and that decreased performance. It's also important to note, like from an academic standpoint, that it could also be students committing SAE against each other in a classroom. And that in that situation, a professor should really stand up and be an ally to support the students so that they are not, that they can feel included in that classroom as well. I will share like a personal example on this one. So my name's Kaija. It's a little weird. And I have had professors who will literally go the entire semester without saying my name right or learning it. And one of my professors, a couple years back, he never got my name right, and he repeatedly kept asking me like where I'm from. And I kept telling him like, Groton, New York, like small town, I'm from New York. But he was just unable to grasp the concept that I could be an American because of my name. And he kept asking like, well, where are your parents from then? And things like that, which made me feel uncomfortable in the classroom. It made me feel like, like, why is he having a problem with my name? Like, why does he think that I don't belong here? Things like that. So it can be really detrimental to learning, and it really does hurt that connection between professors and students. So what can we do? We can have conversations about SAE. So when you see it happen, or when you're the target, or even if you're the initiator and then you realize, oh, I shouldn't have said that, talking to the people that are involved is a really good way to enhance trust and collaboration and create a more inclusive organizational culture. So, and academic environment. So basically, when you talk about it, when you say, hey, what you said was hurtful or what you said was wrong for this reason, and the other person, the initiator, is like, oh, I see that now, or okay, I'm going to try to do better in the future, then you feel more included, you feel safer talking to that person, and it really just builds that connection that you have with that person. And it's also the most important part about it is that it's actually been proven to reverse the negative impacts, or at the very least limit them. So especially when an ally stands up for you, those negative effects like the increased depression and the cardiovascular disease, they just go away, and it can even turn this very negative experience into something positive, because instead of sitting there and thinking, oh, the people in my classroom, they don't want me to be here, like you sit there and you think, wow, everyone has my back here, everyone is on my side and is going to help me through this situation. So now's a little reflection activity to kind of get you thinking about having conversations about SE and how it's really not that big of a step from what we already do in our lives. So in your personal life, if your friend or your partner says something rude to you, you're probably going to be like, hey, why'd you say that? That upset me. because otherwise it's going to damage your relationship, right? So let's take a couple minutes to think about and write it down if you want, a time when someone said something hurtful to you. How did it feel? What did you do? Did it affect your relationship? Things like that. So just take a few minutes to think about that. And if you want to share it in the chat or out loud, go for it, but you don't have to, no pressure.
Yeah, I was hearing a little bit of an echo, I think, from over there. Were you hearing it? It was distracting me.
I'm not sure why. It must be mine above it. Try that.
Tape. Oh, yeah.
Should be okay. Sorry about that.
That's fine.
It was coming from that phones. I didn't know that was muted.
Okay, so wrap up your thoughts. Hopefully that was a good reflection. We kind of tied it into other conversations that you might be having. Now we'll kind of get into how does that conversation actually go? What can you actually do? So if you're a target or an ally, so you're either the person that experienced it or you witnessed it and you want to try to help the person that experienced it, there's a couple things that you could do. It's important to remember that if you're an ally, you want to be supporting the target and amplifying the target's voice and not talking over them. So don't speak for the target, and you don't want to like kind of claim it as like this was my experience, right? Because it's not about you, it's about the target if you're an ally. But otherwise, everything's the same. So the first step is deciding whether to act. So you have a couple of options. You could act right away. So in the moment they say it and you say, hey, don't say that. You can act later. So you can come back to it maybe later that day or even like in a week and be like, hey, this thing happened and it's really bothering me. Or you cannot act at all, which is a perfectly fine choice in certain situations. The point of this presentation is not to say every time someone says something or does something hurtful, you have to say something, because that's not true. But if it's something that's bothering you or something that's repeatedly happening, then it's probably a good idea to say something if you are safe and able to. So some of the things that you have to consider when you're deciding when and whether to act is your relationship to the initiator. So going back to the academic world, if you're a student and it's a professor, that can be a really scary situation because they do have your grade under control, right? So there's that pressure. Or if you're in the workplace and it's your boss that said it, right? They have that power over you. So that can be something that's kind of a deciding factor. But you also have to consider like what type of boss are they? So are they someone that's like, hey, I'm really open to feedback, tell me if I do something that's not good, then that's a great person to go to and say, hey, you said this and that's a problem. If there's someone that's like, everything I do is right and you can't tell me that I'm wrong, then that's probably a situation where you don't want to say anything. You also have to think about the environmental context. So is this in the middle of a giant classroom or a giant meeting where there's maybe a lot of peers there, or maybe even your boss's supervisors there? That's not a good environment to say something, because the initiator is going to get defensive because there's a lot of people involved. And it feels more aggressive to call them out there than to maybe later on come to them and have that personal conversation. So you want to try to do it in more smaller contexts or one-on-one situations, things like that. And then you have to consider the potential consequences to reacting. So if it is a professor who maybe doesn't grade fairly, that might not be a good person to react to say something to, because that could impact your grade. Or if it's a boss who's really not open to feedback, that can have negative impacts on your workplace. So those are the things that you have to keep in mind. But if you decide that you're going to act, the next step is managing your emotions. Because if you're going to have a conversation with someone, you need to walk into it feeling calm, feeling ready, and not overly emotional. Because, as I'm sure everyone knows, if you're really emotional in the conversation, it tends to get heated really fast. So you want to go into it assuming good intent. With SAE, obviously the impact is more important than the intention, but it's also good to keep in mind that they are often unintentional actions, and the person committing them often doesn't even know that what they're saying is a subtle act of exclusion. So you want to go into it thinking, okay, this person doesn't know what they did wrong. And it's more of an educational conversation. It's something to build your relationship. It's something to help them grow as a person and continue you two getting along. You want to keep a positive mindset and be objective. So try to keep things like, this is what happened, and not so much like, it seemed to me like you were being aggressive, like more like what you said was this, and it made me feel this way. Staying calm. So like I said, you don't want to start screaming at the person. You don't want to get heated, because that's not going to be productive. And then it's just going to turn into a screaming match, and that's not going to go anywhere. And then if you're having that conversation and you start to feel yourself getting really emotional, or you start to feel really angry, you might need to step away and say, hey, I just need a minute to collect myself. Let's continue this conversation later. But once you're ready, once you're in the right mind space and you're like, okay, I feel comfortable responding to this action, then you can start that conversation. So you're going to recap the action, say, this is what you said or did, explain the problem. So if it's something like a professor repeatedly asking me where I'm from, I'd say, okay, you asked me where I'm from like 6 times. The problem with that is it's suggesting that I couldn't be telling the truth, that I couldn't be American, and that excludes me from the culture that I was raised in, and you're like suggesting that my name can't fit my personality or my person or who I am. Share the personal impact. So I didn't feel comfortable in the classroom anymore. I didn't feel comfortable talking to you in conversations with you because I felt very excluded. And then making sure that you disarm the initiator. So this isn't an attack on you as a person. I'm not saying you're a horrible person. I'm just bringing up something that left me feeling uncomfortable, so that we can rebuild a relationship and we can get along in a positive way, and letting them know what they can do better next time. So next time, if you ask someone where they're from and they say New York, just leave it at that. That's where they're from, right? So you don't need to dig into it. It's honestly none of your business. But maybe say that in a nicer way. But it's not something that needs to be brought up that many times. So in the future, if you want to know where someone's from, just ask it once and then move on. Something like that is a good example of how to have that conversation. But it is a conversation, so you're going to be listening to them as well as talking, right? Because conversations go both ways. So you want to also learn about their perspective, because it is possible that this is something that maybe they experience this a lot, and so they just kind of learned this behavior, or for whatever reason they learned this behavior, they think it's okay, right? And you want to know why that is, because maybe it's an unconscious bias that they have that they need to work on unlearning, and they don't know that they have it. So if you can be like, hey, it seems like you have this bias, that can be really helpful. You also want to know if they actually were trying to hurt you, because for your sake, that might not be a person you want to have a relationship with. So that's a good thing to figure out. You want to ask why and what they meant by it. That kind of leans into like figuring out what the underlying reason for them saying it was. And then make sure that from what they're saying to you, that it's clear that they are understanding what the problem is with what they said or did. Because if they don't understand the problem, then the conversation's pointless. They're not going to learn from it. They're not going to do better in the future. And then at some point, the conversation will be unproductive or over, right? So notice when dialogue isn't productive anymore, whether you're going in circles or you've just said everything that needs to be said. Maybe you're in agreement. Maybe it's like one of those situations where you just have to agree to disagree, right? So in the conversation, and maybe follow up later, check in with them, be like, hey, how are you feeling about our conversation? Or do you have any follow-up questions, things like that. And then on the personal side of it, you want to process your emotions and then let them go. Find a safe space to reflect, find a friend or a colleague to confide in, and just like get that negative experience out of you so that you don't have those negative impacts that we talked about in the beginning. Because the whole point of this is really to make sure that when you experience subtle acts of exclusion, you don't walk away from it with those negative impacts, because they're always going to happen. There's no way to like permanently stop subtle acts of exclusion from happening, but we want to make sure that when they do happen, it's more of a positive experience than a negative one, as much as it can be. So another activity time. This one is kind of to build a bit of empathy for the initiator, so that when a subtle act of exclusion occurs, if you're the target or the ally and you want to say something, you can think about, okay, in what way can I say this without making them feel defensive? How can I say this so that they really understand? So a good way to do that is to think about a time when you committed an SAE, because we all have. I've done it. I'm sure every single one of you has done it at least once. So think about that time. Think about if anyone said anything to you. You know, did you get defensive about it? Do you feel defensive about it right now, thinking about how you've done it? Things like that. I'll give you a couple minutes to do that, and then that's a great tool to keep in mind for if you ever do bring up an action like this. Okay, so kind of wrap up your thoughts, and then we're going to move into the initiator side of things. So, because like I said, everyone commits SAE, it's really important to know what to do when you're the person that commits it and someone comes to you and says, hey, what you said was hurtful in this way, things like that. So, the important things to remember right off the bat, if someone comes to you and is saying that you committed an SAE, keep in mind that they're not attacking you or accusing you. You don't need to get defensive. It doesn't mean that you're a bad person, because literally everyone does it. And even if you're a marginalized person, or even if it's a marginalized social identity that you have, you can still commit that SAE. So don't use that as an excuse to say, well, I couldn't have said that because of this. Like, you did say it, you did something wrong, but that's okay. It doesn't make you horrible. It just means that there's still room for you to grow. We all still have room to grow. So it's just a good opportunity to learn about something that maybe you didn't know before, or a weakness that you have, and improve on it for the future. So another activity. This one is for building empathy. So you want to think about your own marginalized identities and writing down a situation where you experienced SE, where you were excluded, anything like that. So that you can kind of feel, you want to know both sides. You want to know what it's like to be the initiator. You want to know what it's like to be the target. That way, when you have these conversations, you're able to bring your best self to them and get the most out of them. So think about situation, what happened, how did you feel, and then if there's any negative feelings still associated with it, so if it was something that made you feel like you didn't belong, reframe that as a positive affirmation. So I do belong, something like that. And this is also really helpful for kind of dealing with some of those negative impacts and reactions that you're still having to something that may have happened a while ago. It's a great tool to use after an SAE occurs, especially if you don't feel like addressing it, to kind of think about like, okay, this made me feel this way, but that's not true, and reframe it so that you don't have those negative impacts. So I'll give you a couple minutes for that. Okay, so wrap up any thoughts you have. So once you have that empathy, right, and you think about it from the other person's perspective, and you want to remember that when they come to you, it's really important that you focus on listening. So you want to bring that empathy and empathize with the person, listen to what they're saying, understand what they're saying, and use your own experiences to really get how that impacted them. And then remember that if someone is coming to you to say, hey, you committed this SAE and this is how it affected me, that means that they value your relationship and that they trust your intentions. Because, like we talked about when we were talking about targets and allies, you have to feel comfortable with the person to bring it up to them. It has to feel safe, right? So if someone is bringing it up to you, that is really a compliment that says that they trust that you're a safe person and that you're open to feedback like this and that you want to learn and grow, right? So it really is something to think about, like this is a compliment to you. And that is a huge help in not getting defensive, because if you think about it like, okay, they value me, they value our relationship, then that should help you come into it more open-minded, which is really important to actually getting the most out of the conversation. You want to make sure that you're setting aside your ego, that you're staying calm, and that you're not taking things personally. So it can be really hard sometimes when someone comes to you and says that you did something wrong to admit that you did something wrong, right? So, but this is a situation where you have to admit it because you did something wrong, and that's okay. It's okay to make mistakes. But you just have to be willing to take accountability for it and move on and do better in the future. And again, it's not an attack on you, so you don't need to take it personally. Don't think that the person coming to you saying that you're a problem or that they don't like you. It's not anything like that. They do like you, they value you, they want you to be better. And then if you need to step away because you're feeling defensive or you just aren't in a headspace where you can have this conversation. Maybe you have a meeting in a couple minutes and you just don't have time, or you're in the middle of a really stressful project and having this conversation is just not really accessible to you in that moment. Just let the person know that. Be like, hey, I'm not trying to make excuses, but I have a meeting in a couple minutes and I'm really not in the right headspace to have this conversation. But I really want to hear what you have to say. I really want to rectify the situation. Can we continue this discussion later? Put some time on your calendar right then and there so you don't forget, or shoot them an email or whatever you need to do. But make sure that if you say, hey, I need a break to talk before we talk about this, that you do actually follow up. Because saying, hey, I need a break, and then never following up with them, never continuing that conversation doesn't reflect well on you, and it will probably damage your relationship even more than committing the SAE did. And then following through. So they've told you what you said they told you how it was a problem, and they told you what you can do better in the future. So now what you have to do is commit to that change and avoid repeating the behavior. So if it's the example that I used before, and I said to the professor, hey, next time, maybe don't ask someone where they're from just because their name seems different. Or if you are going to ask, only ask once, right? Believe their answer the first time. Then in the future, you commit to that change. You don't ask more than once, or maybe you don't ask at all because you realize like it's not really relevant and it doesn't really matter. So something like that where you avoid repeating that behavior and you make sure that what the person told you, you're actually thinking about it, right? So when you go, maybe you meet someone else with a really strange name and you go to ask where are you from, and you remember that conversation. You think, no, that's not a good question to ask, or that can feel exclusionary, and then you don't say it. And then thank them for bringing it to your attention, right? Because we said it's a compliment, and they're trying to help you be a better person, and they're trying to help make sure that your relationship with them stays positive. So you want to thank them for their time, and thank them for the education, because it is really important to your relationship and just to you being a better person, because we're all every day making mistakes and trying to become better. So anytime that someone helps you with that, you should really thank them for that, and be considerate and polite and really consider the feedback that they're giving you. And then the last thing that I want to talk about is acts of inclusion. So we've been talking a lot about acts of exclusion, but beyond just trying to stop acts of exclusion and dealing with them when they happen, another really awesome thing to do is start doing more acts of inclusion. So bringing more people in, making sure that everyone in the classroom or in the workplace feels included instead of excluded. If you see someone who's maybe seems like they don't feel comfortable, maybe have a conversation with them, try to get their perspectives and their opinions included. Things like that, just to make sure that we are doing things that are positive, that have positive impacts on people, instead of things that have negative impacts on people, because there's always going to be a lot of negativity in this world, and you don't want to be the person that's bringing that negativity in. You want to be the person that's fighting it with positivity. So doing things that are inclusive, and trying to reframe things into inclusivity instead of exclusivity is really important. So if anyone has any questions, I am here. Thank you for your time and for listening. I really appreciate it when people come to this presentation, because it is such an important topic and I did put so much time into it. So thank you all for coming. If you want to go over more examples, I'm totally into that. If you want to reach out to me anytime for questions, or if you want these slides to share with other people, I'm also willing to do that. So I also have different versions of this presentation for workplaces, for all the different things. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me or type them in the chat now.
Kaija, your slides are awesome. Did you use What program did you use?
I made them in PowerPoint originally,
Mhm.
yeah. So PowerPoint all the way. I love PowerPoint.
Okay.
And then I transferred to Google Slides so I
Mhm.
could access it
Yeah.
without doing the multi-factor authentication.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Let's say like a person commits a subtle act of exclusion and then kind of like realizes it later.
Yeah.
The person that was excluded, they don't bring it up. So aside from like realizing it and then committing to not do it again,
Mhm.
I wonder, should we apologize to the person when we like realize it later and they didn't say anything about it? Should we bring it back up? Or should we just commit to like not doing it again?
That's a good question. That's tough. I think it really depends on your relationship with the person. So if it's someone who's like a really close friend or someone you work with every day and you have a good relationship, I would say it's probably a good idea to maybe say like, hey, I realized last night maybe what I said to you the other day was a problem. Do you want to talk about it? Do you have any visual feelings that any way I can make you feel better about it? Like I'm gonna work really hard not to do it again. I think that is a good thing to do in a way that doesn't kind of bring it all back up for them, right? So don't like recap the whole action, but maybe just say like, hey, I'm open to talking about it if you want to. If it's someone that you're maybe not as close to or someone that you might not see again or won't see often, I would say it's probably not necessary to do it, but it is really like a lot of the things with this topic is it's really personal to the situation. So I think that the main thing is committing to change, like you said. So at the very least, you decide, okay, I'm gonna do better in the future. But yeah, it's really situational.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? I will say there's like a ton of research out there on this topic. So if you want to dive into more into it or learn more about it, using Penfield Library website obviously is a great resource. There's a lot of articles on there, but also just a quick Google search. You can find a lot more information if it's something that you're really interested in or want to learn more about. I'm not an expert, so there is a ton more information out there than I have if you want even deeper knowledge on it. But otherwise, if there are no more questions, thank you all for your time, and I hope that this was helpful. Thanks, Kaija.
Thank you.